Hello, welcome to CubsPS Plus, the Northside Numbers Game, a weekly podcast that dives headfirst into the analysis of hot topics driving Chicago Cubs baseball. I'm your host, Mike Waller, a lifelong Cub fan, full-time baseball stat nerd, and sometime youth baseball coach. CubsPS Plus is part of the Bleacher Bunch Productions on the Fans First Sports Network, joining great shows like The Sun Ranto Show, Cup of Cubby Blue, and Baseball Rabbit Hole. To find us, just search your podcatcher for the Bleacher Bunch. And CubsPS Plus is always available ad-free to Patreon supporters at patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, where you can support the show and find a variety of benefits for as little as $1 a month. In addition to the podcast feeds, you can also find me on Twitter or X, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. A spin on the baseball metric, OPS Plus. Love the pod or hate it? Please drop a review wherever it is you get your podcasts. If you've done that, thank you. Maybe you can share an episode with a friend. It's September 10th, 2024. The Cubs are 74-70, and it's Imanaga versus Yamamoto tonight in LA. How cool is that? Are you ready? I'm ready. Here we go. Welcome into episode 88. Everything for the Cubs right now is focused on 88. No former players won the number, but that's the number of wins the Cubs probably have to have in order to have any shot at the third wild card. With 18 games to go, the Cubs are trailing the Braves and the Mets for that third wild card, and to get to 88, it's a 14-4 finish. Spend those losses wisely. At this point, that's not a prediction. That's not a projection. That's just the math. I mean, most seasons, I think the third wild card in both leagues, you're going to have a pretty good shot if you get to 86 wins. This year has clearly trended stronger than that. I mean, the Diamondbacks and Padres have been well above that, though they're falling back a little bit after hot Julys for both of them. And it's progressing out now like it really looks like that last wild card is going to be at 88, 89 wins. The Cubs don't have tiebreak with any of those teams, so wherever it lands, the Cubs have to be one better than that. So it could mean the Cubs have to get to 89 wins and go 15-3. They might have to win 90 and go 16-2. None of this is likely. The Cubs have 2 games left against the Dodgers. Then they go to Colorado, which was a house of horrors for them last year. Then they come home and face the A's, who not a good baseball team, but they've actually been playing some decent baseball lately, beating some teams. Then they got 4 against Washington. We saw with Pittsburgh, the Cubs went in and absolutely demolished Pittsburgh in their place, and then came back to Chicago and lost 2 out of 3. And the Cubs hitting numbers, it's all over Twitter, social media, the broadcast. I mean, the Cubs offense is way down at Wrigley this year, and the Cubs are certainly no exception. They're also pitching better at home. Other teams are scoring less there. It's playing like the 27th worst offensive park in baseball this season, which is pretty significant. I mean, Wrigley has this reputation for the wind blowing out, lots of home runs. It typically tends to play a little more as a pitcher's park, especially, you get beginning and end of the season, you get some of those cold weather games, the wind tends to blow in, ball doesn't carry. But it's been particularly so this year. So, we'll see. Then all bets are off. And then the Cubs do still have to go to Philly for 3 games after the National Series. And then they wrap up back home again against Cincinnati, who's been a thorn in their side for years. So, is 14-4, 15-3, 16-2 likely? No. Is this team capable of it? Yeah. So, as I've said on social media a couple times, hope is cheap. Hope is also the thing that kills you. But I'm going to keep it till I can't. Give me a reason to watch the baseball games. And after at least the Bears salvaged the weekend of football, watching the Iowa Hawkeyes again fail to score enough points and give a game away to Iowa State, that's no bueno. So today's going to be kind of a hodgepodge. If you're hearing this, I decided I like the episode enough to keep it. I have several half-baked plans that we're not ready to go today. I didn't want to go any longer without getting something out. But as we head into this last stretch, like whatever happens over the next 4, 5, 6 ball games, that may very well end effectively the Cubs' contention portion of the season. So last year they played meaningful baseball games into the last week of September. They were not technically eliminated until day 161. Probably not going to be the case this year, but hey, you know what? Teams have gotten hot. I mean, the A's back in 2001, the Moneyball team, they had that huge winning streak. They won 29 of their last 33. And in 2018, when the Brewers had to have a frantic run to catch the Cubs in the division, they won 22 of their last 29. So these runs do happen occasionally. It's rare. Even if they go on a 14-4 run, a 15-3 run, they still need a little bit of help from those other teams. Those other teams would have to fall below 88, 89 wins. I think it's possible. I think it's very possible that the third wild card winds up being, say, 87 wins, but time will tell. So this week, I want to focus on a number of things and kind of set up the next few episodes of this podcast. So as we head into this offseason, the big news the last couple days has been the report that in spite of some, quote, friction in the Cubs front office, as reported by Bob Nightingale, said, there's some friction in the Cubs front office, but that Jed is likely to return for 2025. Now, I've always thought Jed was going to return for 2025. That's not a surprise to me at all whatsoever. The fact that there may be some friction, I think, is probably a positive thing. I mean, the worst case scenario, regardless of your feelings on Jed Hoyer, and I'll get into mine over the course of the next probably several episodes, is things have not gone super smoothly well. I mean, some of it is the way the Cubs have presented things. Often that's Jed. Sometimes it's what they've done. Sometimes it's the messages they've sent by reading their actions, reading between the lines. But, I mean, going back to 2021, it was very clear. So when Theo Epstein resigned after 2020, gave up the last year of his deal, the writing was pretty much on the wall that there were going to have to be some big changes as the old core of Javi and KB and Rizzo, who we just saw this week for the first time back in Wrigley, which was pretty spectacular. As those guys were coming to their walk years, there were going to have to be choices made. Who to extend, who not to extend, who to trade, who not to trade. Do you keep any of them? And we know how that turned out. But from the start, most of the trades in 2021, both before the season, starting with the Yu Darvish deal, all through the other deals, for the most part, those trades were made for pieces that were years away. I mean, Yu Darvish got traded before the 2021 season, and while he's a top 100 prospect, Owen Casey is still not to the major leagues yet. I mean, he's 22, 23, so that's not a problem. But the Cubs traded Yu Darvish for a bunch of teenagers, and it may well be that Owen Casey is the only one that ever sees Chicago. PCA was super young. He's up in the major leagues now, looking like a really good player. I'm not going to get into all the details of the trade here, but one of my upcoming episodes is going to be to actually break down Jed Hoyer's trades since he came on. But what the larger message was that was not going to be a rebuild. This is not a rebuild. We're kind of retooling, whatever. We knew from the start, you can call it what you want, it was a rebuild. They had to find out about some guys who performed really well after the trade deadline in 2021. Frank Schwindel, Rafael Ortega, Patrick Wisdom. Were any of those guys dudes, or did they have to continue to build and look other places? And then 2022 was another season where they added a couple pieces in free agency and made some moves, but they didn't put together a serious contend for the division team that year. It was more of a find out year. Let's get some young kids up. There were some that went really well. Now, in those sorts of scenarios, when you're in rebuild mode, whether you call it rebuild mode or not, I think every clear answer you get is a positive. Now, not all the news is positive. Like, it was not a positive that Frank Schwindel was not a legitimate major league player. It means they had to go find somebody else to fill the spot, but they found an answer. They also found an answer on Justin Steele, who's been fantastic since 2022. They brought up Christopher Morel for the first time, and he had his issues this year before getting traded, but that looked like a guy who could play at the major league level. They, got some positive news on some guys in the bullpen, and I won't go into all the old detail here, but they got some answers. Last year was supposed to be a year where they were going to compete. We'll eventually talk about Jed's decisions and how he spent his money and how he worked the prospects. There were missed opportunities in 2022 to find out who guys were. And those are the unfortunate moves that continue to set the organization back. I'm not saying Matt Mervis is ever going to be a dude. At this point, it looks like he probably won't be. But in 2022, we could have gotten a much better read on him than we do now. In 2023, we could have gotten a much better read on him than we have now. And so as we go through this with Jed, there should be friction. It's not gone super well. The Cubs have no playoff appearances under his watch. The Cubs have come close. The Cubs have been wildly inconsistent. They have been super streaky. They have been disappointing. I mean, I thought last year's team was fun. Last year's team wound up They wound up where I thought they would wind up, just out of the playoffs, 83 wins. But they got there in a much more fun way than I had predicted. This year's team they're not going to reach what I thought they were going to reach unless they go on an absolute tear, in which case it will completely change my view of the entire season probably. I picked them for 90 wins. I thought they could win the division. Neither one of those things is going to happen barring an absolute miracle. This team has been, I've said it on this podcast before, this season in 2004 are my two biggest disappointments as a Cub fan. I'll throw 1985 in there, but completely different reasons. I mean, coming off that 84 season, you just can't lose your entire starting rotation to the injured list in 3 weeks in June. And most of those guys miss significant time and expect to stay in a race. Like, I know you have to have starting pitching depth and things were different back in the mid 80s, but that's a lot to lose. So different category for me. I wound up disliking a good chunk of the 2004 team, which is interesting. It all stems from the Kent Merker and Dusty Baker feud with Chip Carey and Steve Stone in the broadcast booth, and sort of all that tension, the angst among the team. On the whole, looking back, that should have been a really likable team. I mean, Greg Maddux was on it. He came back, got his 300th win. Kerry Wood, Mark Pryor, Matt Clement, Carlos Zambrano, who at that point was still, fun and exuberant, and maybe, people's opinions changed at times over the years, but Ramos Ramirez, Derek Lee, Moises Alou, Sammy Sosa was gone, which was a change. They traded for Nomar Garciaparra. Like, there was a lot to like about that team, but the way that season ended, the team could never get out of its own way. It could never get healthy enough. They shot themselves in the foot with some of the self-created distractions and things that went on. And they missed the playoffs they choked out a playoff bid. And this team is, on an individual basis, probably a little bit less likable than the 2004 team. It's just, this team does not have a lot of personalities. Now, PCA has been a lot of fun. Seiya Suzuki is fun at times. Shota Imanaga is amazing. I'm excited to watch him face Yoshinobu Yamamoto tonight. But this team as a whole has really been pretty boring to watch most of the season. And so Jed has to combat that. And then, Jed also has to battle what he's put in place. So for the question of bringing him back, I'm ambivalent. If something changes and things don't, the meetings between Jed and Tom at the end of the season don't go the way Tom wants them to go, and they wind up firing Jed, I'm okay with it. I mean, he has done his time. He has had some successes. The farm system is much improved. The product on the field has improved, although not as much as I think it should have, and it should not have gotten as bad as it did, which I will also say Theo carries some of that blame too. I mean, Theo didn't do a whole lot from the end of 2018 to 2020, messed everything up, but 2018, 2019, Jed did not do a ton to really give that core a chance to transition. Ideally, you would extend one or two of them, maybe trade somebody, kind of refresh, and if somebody's getting more expensive, you ship them out for a younger player. Like, there were always pieces they needed, and there were areas of strength they could have traded from, and they didn't. So bringing Jed back, the general consensus I see looking at social media, hearing fans talk, not so much the broadcast because that's marquee and obviously that's Cubs driven, is that that's a message to fans to set your expectations lower for 2025. And this is where I disagree. Now, Jed may not be good enough to pull it off, but the one thing I'll continue to say about Tom, and I've got my issues with the Ricketts family, I've got my issues with the way Tom has handled things, particularly since 2018, 2019. Tom has spent money. I've gone over it in podcasts before. I'm sure I'll go over it again this offseason. Tom has spent over the cap multiple times, a couple times significantly. He's been top 5 in payroll in baseball. We can make all the arguments about whether they should be there all the time. I tend to think they should. I think they should spend more than they do. But the idea that Tom is super cheap and won't lay out the money to have a winning baseball team is just garbage. I mean, the last 2 seasons, they've spent either right below or right above the competitive balance tax threshold. Last year was definitely a tick below. This year is still being projected as a tick below, but the Cubs have said they expect to go over. So we'll see how the math comes out on that. Certainly if Bell drops out of his contract, they will absolutely go over. And as I said in one of my recent episodes, they'll go over in the dumbest way possible. But they spend enough to do it. And Tom has also said consistently over the last 2.5 seasons that there's been more money on the table that Jed could have spent than he spent. So I do believe, and going back to my views on Tom typically says things in as generic a way as possible. He's vaguely PR decent. He's not very inflammatory, but he is typically pretty honest with the fans. Not honest in detail, not honest in emotion, not honest in those things. But if he says that money was there to be spent, I believe him. Because probably his biggest gaffe of his ownership time was after 2020, when the whole world was broke and reeling from COVID and all the things. And I can understand at that point, didn't like it, whatever. Some teams pulled back payroll because they didn't know what the finances were going to look like in 2021, especially between coming out of COVID and also heading into the labor stoppage potential. I can see it from the business standpoint. I'm not going to defend it. I also meant to preface this entire episode with everything I say. Do not take anything I say as an endorsement of Jed. I'm very meh on Jed. I'm going to give him credit for the things I think he's done well. I will call out the things I think he's done poorly. I don't think he's been bad enough where he absolutely positively has to be fired right now to give the Cubs any hope of success. But I also won't defend him. And you know, if Tom fires him, you won't hear anything from me defending him and fighting against the decision. I mean, the Cubs are where they are right now, and he has 1 year left. But the reason I say not to necessarily set your expectations lower is that if Tom truly doesn't believe that Jed is the guy, or if Jed has communicated and his plan is to take this team, run it back again, I think he'd be out. Because while Tom spends enough to win-ish, however you want to define that for yourself, if you spend $233 million and you're spending more than every other team in the Central, and you're outspending most teams in the Central by $20 to $50 to $80 million in player salary, you should absolutely be able to compete for a division championship and a wild card. You should probably be the division champ. Let's be honest about it. And they're not. So there's no way I buy that Tom is just content with Jed and just like, oh, Jed can just stay here and do his thing for as long as possible. I don't believe that for a second. If Jed didn't care, or if Tom didn't care about winning at all, he'd run the payroll about where the most of the division does and run out there $180, $90 million payroll of a bunch of guys, find a couple players the fans like and trot it out there and hope they can get to 500. It's not what he's doing. Now, he's not Steve Cohen either, where, you know, Steve Cohen just wants to load up and go spend $350 to $400 million and do his best to put an all-star team out there. You know, I mean, that's a perfectly valid defense or perfectly valid strategy too. And honestly, I'd love it. But I don't believe that Jed is happy with where things stand right now. That's where I think that reported friction comes from. I totally believe there's friction. I don't know about within the organization, but sports are a competitive business. And people get into sports because they love the sports. A lot of people who were in the organization were former players, former coaches. Carter Hawkins played at Vanderbilt. These guys have lived and died baseball their whole lives. There's no way they just want to come in and try to be the averagest team out there and just continue to collect a paycheck. I don't know all the people. I'm sure there are some people that don't fit this personality profile in the organization for sure, because it's a big organization. You get a lot of different kinds of people. But I guarantee you there are a lot of type A's in there that want to win, think they know the best thing to do, and are trying to push those ideas and go. So when it's not going, there's going to be frustration. I fully expect there will be changes this offseason. Last year, Craig Counsell largely kept most of the staff intact. There were a few positions that changed over. We'll see what happens. Popular refrain is fire the hitting coach. Again, I'm ambivalent there. I don't know enough about what's happened in the organization to know whether that's going to help. But what I have seen is since 2017, I think the Cubs have fired 5 hitting coaches. So clearly just firing the hitting coach and bringing somebody else in is not some panacea that magically fixes everything. I do know the Cubs prior to 2023, I believe, made a conscious decision to try to have a consistent organizational message from the complex league, actually probably the Dominican League, all the way through the major leagues, to have, just like they've done with the pitching side, have a hitting infrastructure that is consistent with messaging, with technique. One can argue whether that's the best approach or not, but just like we saw with the pitching infrastructure, it took a couple years for that to develop. So that may matter. And at the top level, when we look at the Cubs this year, grading the hitting coach, again, I think it's very hard. It's very hard to know what to assign to the hitting coach and what not to. But let's take the goods and the bads. I mean, I think Nico has not had as good of a season, but if you look at his hit profile, his hit metrics, they look a lot like what they've typically looked like. So I'm not super concerned there. Dansby has had a bad year up until the last month-ish, and he's improved. Now, I don't think any of that, I don't think his slumping and I don't think his comeback has a whole heck of a lot to do with the hitting coach. I think he looks like the same old Dansby. He's always been streaky. He's always been wildly hot, wildly cold. I think Dansby is more a function of health. I mean, we know, starting with that, I can't remember if it started with or ended with the Astros series when the Cubs swept them, Dansby Swanson was playing through a knee injury for a couple of weeks. And after that had to go on the injured list. And it was pretty clear that the knee injury coincided with him coming off what had been a decent April for him. And the power just hasn't been there for the most part this season. And that's all consistent with a guy who's playing on a bum knee. When you're hitting, there's a lot of torque. There's a lot of start and hard stop. You hear hitting coaches talk about, that moment where your hands whip through and your weight transitions and you get that torque in your body. That's like basically a car crash on your front leg. You're taking all your momentum and you're just basing it in the ground so that your hands can fly and hammer the ball. Whether it's his twist knee or his plant knee, neither one is going to hold up super well in that sort of environment. So if he's injured, he's either not going to be generating as much force going forward, or he's not going to be able to carry that force through and transfer it to his hands and his core the way he would if he can really have that solid front leg. So, that's a big one for me. Seiya Suzuki has been largely good all season when he's been healthy. Ian Happ got off to a slow start, but again, he had that hamstring to start the season. Didn't really miss a lot of time with it, but you could tell early in the season he wasn't right. But he's been having the best season of his career since mid-May. So, I mean, I'm not too worried about him. From other guys, we've seen growth. So Christopher Morel is one where we didn't see the growth. Well, actually, I'll correct that. We did see growth. We saw him very, very clearly adjust his approach and cut down that strikeout rate. Now, last year at times, and in 2022, sometimes that strikeout rate was pushing 40%, which is way too high. I said before the season I wanted him to get down below 30, maybe hang around 25, 26. With his power, that could be a decent place to be. Well, he cut his K rate down below 20% for a good chunk of the season, and his walk rate at times was up close to 12%. So those are both big gains, and that's clear. And he did it for a long enough period of time that's sticky. That wasn't just, oh, look, he's had a good couple of weeks. I mean, that was 3 months. Now there's some trade-off there, and he's 24 years old. He's going to continue to evolve as a hitter and make adjustments. But, excuse me, in doing that, I think he sacrificed some power. And I think he also got into very much a rut with how he hit the baseballs. We're kind of seeing that with Itzhak Paredes right now. Morel would hit the ball hard, but he tended to hit it in kind of the same sort of spots, so he wasn't necessarily a hard guy to defend. He's not a Cub anymore, so we don't have to continue to talk about him, but he's an example, another one that kind of went south this year. So in all of those cases, maybe you do look to the hitting coaching. On the flip side, We saw Michael Busch, who had never played in the major leagues, well, never stuck in the major leagues. He'd had some cups of coffee with the Dodgers. He got the first base job to start the season, came up, got off to a great start. But as major league pitching does, it will adjust to you. When you're a rookie without a lot of hype or hoopla, they're just going to pitch to you and see if you can hit it. And he proved he can hit it. So the league had to adjust to him, and they made adjustments, and he went into a pretty good slump for a good month after that initial hot stretch. And he came back out of it. He's had a nice season. He's one of the Cubs leaders in OPS and WRC plus, and he's faded back a little bit since then, but he's also a rookie going through his first season like this. I mean, there's no grind like Major League Baseball. So, I don't think his recent slump, I think it's probably more fatigue. And again, when he came back and had another really good stretch, pitchers are going to adjust to him again. So he's got to counter adjust and continue to do that. But the fact that he was able to make those adjustments is a huge positive. The fact that PCA came up arguably too early after not really even having that great of a season in AAA, came up when Bellinger was out, Tauchman was out, there were some injuries. And the Cubs just decided, we're going to let him play. And he got sent down once briefly, and I think that's when Tauchman got hurt, or maybe that's when Bellinger broke his finger. I forget the exact timelines. Feel free to come at me on social media if you want to correct something. But once PCA came up the second time, this dude's going to play. He's had a few random days off here and there, but not many. And he struggled. He came up, it almost looked like he was pre-guessing on which pitches he wanted to swing at. Like, okay, I'm going to swing this time no matter where the ball is. Or I'm not going to swing this time no matter where the ball is. But it was adjustment. He had to see the pitches. He had to adjust to the movement and the way pitchers were going to pitch him. And he really started to figure it out the last 2 months, certainly 6 weeks. I think at this point we're at 2 months. He's hitting, in August he hit over 300, showed some power, had that incredible inside the park home run, hit some bombs, absolute bombs. And he's shown real growth. He has shown he is capable of hitting major league pitching. Now, he's still 22. We have no idea how great he might be or whether he's peaked now. But right now, he can be a Major League Baseball player, especially with his defense and speed. Elite defender, elite base runner, and he's going to hit. And then Miguel Amaya, who I've talked about him a couple times lately. They made a swing change with him. I'm a little tired of them throwing out the date every single time with the updated stats, but early July, they made a change with him, and he went from having a high leg kick to having a wider base and just staying planted. And that's really helped him out. And he's really hit the ball well. He's cooled off a little bit lately, but he was also super hot for a while. And I'm less confident in those changes being sticky with Amaya than I am with PCA. But as I've pointed out before too, PCA was a legitimate top 100 Major League Baseball prospect from 2019 to 2021. Unfortunately, then he hit the run where at the end of 2019, he got injured. He lost the entire 2020 season to COVID. 2021, he got off to a decent start and then tore his UCL, so he had to have Tommy John surgery, which took him out for the bulk of 2021 and the first half plus of 2022. He also had a foot injury while he was coming back from the Tommy John surgery. So just all these injuries kept piling up, and it just cost him critical development time. I mean, he's 25 now, so he played like 63 games at all levels combined over the course of like his 22 to 24-year-old seasons. Like that's when top 100 prospects, some flame out. Not everybody makes it. But that's when those guys develop and get to the major leagues and start to make an impact. And he got to the major leagues last year at a time where he didn't have options. I mean, last year was his last option. He did not have an option this year to go back to Iowa. So when he got off to a rough start, and it was rough. I mean, he had a OPS or WRC plus in the 20s at one point. Certainly for a stretch. I mean, he was absolutely like literally unrosterable, let alone not startable. But that really brought him back, and he went on a tear. He's pushed his numbers up. There was a point where his season numbers were better than Nico Horner's. And that starts to show there is that talent in there. Now, the way he's kind of cooled back off, or maybe pitchers have adjusted to him now because he's got the new stance and a little bit new technique. Probably has different. Every hitter has a hole in his swing. So changing the leg kick probably changed where the hole in his swing is. So he's going to have to counter adjust back. And I don't know. I think the Cubs are still going to have to address more depth at catcher next year because I'm not fully confident he can be the guy. I'm very hopeful he can be the guy, but he's also a plus to the hitting side. And last year, these same hitting coaches improved Cody Bellinger, and those changes have stuck. He's not striking out like he was in LA. He's making a lot more contact. He's not had the power until recently, but again, kind of like Dansby, with the injuries, that's some of it. I mean, when he had a couple, they were small fractures, but when he had a couple fractured ribs from running into the wall in center field, that's going to have an impact. I mean, I've had bruised ribs before with no fracture at all. And I'm not a pro athlete. I'm not at that level, but it just hurt to exist for weeks. So for him to, put that constant torque on with throwing and swinging and running and, for him to have lost some of his power stroke is not surprising at all. Not even a tiny bit. So long-winded way of me to say, I don't know for sure how to judge Dustin Kelly and all the hitting infrastructure below him. I don't think, the way the Cubs have said they want a single organizational message on hitting. Now, we can get into details of that and whether or not that's too prescriptive, whether it's trying to force square pegs into round holes. That's a topic for a different day. But if you're trying to have that sort of consistent framework and that consistent messaging and that consistent terminology and all that stuff the players learn, just firing the hitting coach in Chicago isn't necessarily going to change those underlying organizational things. So, it may mean the entire organizational philosophy is not good enough. We'll find that out over time for sure. But that's where we are. So that might change. I think Craig will probably bring in some more of his own people. Also, every year there are staff people who want to move on and go and do other things. So people are going to want to grow. Somebody may get a head coaching opportunity, or a base coach may have a chance to go be an associate head coach or associate manager or a bench coach or something like that. So opportunities are going to come, go. We'll see who sticks. It's also a lot of people committed to staying when Craig Breslow left last year to go to Boston. We'll find out at some point if more people follow him to Boston or potentially go some other places. So the coaching staff is in flux. Jed's situation's in flux. But I think Jed is only, especially if there's friction, like we were talking about with Jed and his getting his last year. If there's some friction there and he's probably going to be back. There's some thought. Watch to see if he gets an extension. If Jed gets an extension, then Tom is totally cool with what he's been doing. And you can say all you want about status quo going forward because that's probably where Tom wants to stay. I don't believe that's the case, as I've already said. So if Jed doesn't get an extension, he's going into next year as a lame duck. And especially if there's some friction, whether it's friction within the organization or friction between him and his boss, it's just kind of crazy. So we can look at those things, and I'm generally not a fan of the lame duck coaching or GM or whatever situation. I think it leads to a lot of short-term thinking that can be harmful for the organization as a whole. One example in my own personal fandom is I went to the University of Iowa, and I went there during the Tom Davis era of Iowa basketball. I graduated Iowa in 96. Going into the 1997-1998 season, he was coming down to his last contract here. And typically, he had been there for a long time. He'd been there since 1986-87. So, but especially as an older coach, you start getting recruited against, right? And typically there's a rollover to at least push the years a couple years out. Well, at the time, Bob Bowlesby was Iowa's athletic director, and he made the decision that Tom Davis, I think he wanted to fire Tom Davis, which probably ultimately for the health of the program would have been a better move. But I don't think he had the capital to be able to pull it off with his bosses. So he announced that Dr. Tom would be heading into his lame duck year. Well, now, Tom Davis coached it out like he always would. He wanted to win. He wanted to go out on top. They wound up making that was the last Sweet 16 Iowa's been to. His players loved him. They played hard for him that season, all that. But The organization lost that long view. They lost an entire year plus of recruiting because if a coach is staying, even if the coach is thinking he's going to retire in a couple of years, they want their legacy to stay intact. They want to, so they're going to be putting the work into, and the assistant coaches are going to know they're going to be there or have an idea they're going to be there. So they're going to continue to put in the work with the high school freshmen and sophomores and juniors so that those recruiting classes continue to evaluate your program and think about it. Well, once that announcement was made, everybody on Iowa's staff at that moment, it all stopped. Nobody had any idea who the head coach would be, whether any of the assistants would stay. So it killed recruiting for a couple seasons. And so that's what I'm afraid of would be afraid of with most people in this situation. Now, Jed has been so methodical, so risk averse. So let's build it slowly, piece by piece by piece. Let's make sure the full foundation is there. My biggest frustration with him is not taking chances. Now, in this situation, I would be scared that you take a pretty decent farm system with a lot of talent up at the AAA level that appears to be either ready for the major leagues or very close, to completely gut that for a team like maybe the Giants put out there a couple years ago when they won 106 games and pushed the Dodgers. For that lightning in a bottle season, go throw vets at every position so I can show I won, I keep my job, and I move forward. But now I've, kneecapped myself on the way to do it. I've cut off my nose to spite my face. And so maybe I win that season, stay, keep my job. Now I don't have the farm system. Now I've got a bunch of older players that are maybe expensive. They're going to start aging poorly. I do not want those kinds of decisions made. I don't know that Jed would do it altruistically. That like, hey, whether I succeed or fail, I want the next guy to have it great. I think Jed wants to win as much as everybody else does. I think he just sometimes doesn't know how to do it, or gets in his own way, or just doesn't make the decisions don't pan out, or he doesn't make the right decisions. It's been some of everything, honestly, with him. But he's a guy that I don't think is going to make those moves. I do think he's going to take very seriously this offseason, though, trying to get a winner in place. I don't know that necessarily means Juan Soto. I don't even know if Juan Soto wants to leave New York. Honestly, I know he's turned down a number of extension offers in the past, up to like $450 million a few years ago. He's going to go 500 plus, probably going to get $600 million. He might top that. Cubs can afford it. Cubs have enough money coming off the books. By the time you do what the Dodgers did with Ohtani, assuming Soto was willing to defer money and set things up so the AAV is in the $40-50 million per year range. Cubs have like $80 million coming off the books, and that's before they even go over again next year. So you can fit him in. You can get pieces around him. It'll change the pieces maybe you put around him in one of two ways. Either, hey, like the Dodgers did, we just paid $700 million for Shohei Ohtani. Let's load up all the talent we possibly can right now because we got to win as much as possible in the next 5 years. If they go Soto, that's the direction they should go. But even if they don't, the Cubs have a lot of young talent. And one of the things that's great about the farm system, and probably the biggest positive Jed has accomplished in his time, is he's brought the farm system back from when he took over. I think the Cubs were generally looked at as the 26th, 27th, 28th best farm system in baseball, which is atrocious. Some of it was graduation. A bunch of guys had come up, but Theo had traded a lot of guys. I mean, look at guys we keep bringing back, like Itzhak Paredes and Jeimer Candelario and Tyson Miller, and brought back a number of guys that had left the organization. But that was a bad farm system. And he's built it up now where we're actually seeing depth coming from AAA. Now, hopefully you can develop a bunch of stars. That would be the dream path. But as long as you can get depth, get a couple guys that can contribute on the bench that come up through the system. You need to have, you have 8 bullpen arms at any one time. You really should have 5-6 of those guys be homegrown and or like brought in, like Jed's grabbing guys off waivers and making trades for Nate Pearson and some of those kinds of things. Guys who are not yet free agents, they're pre-arb or they're in their arb years, they're relatively cheap. Get a bunch of them, get a bunch of guys who can throw hard, give yourself volume, give yourself depth, give yourself options. Because as we've seen with bullpens are fickle. Relief pitchers are highly variable. Even relief pitchers who have good reputations and have had good careers every season of a relief pitcher is a small sample size. You're talking, for the guys that work a ton, you're talking 70 appearances, 75, maybe 80 innings at the extreme high end. Most guys, you're talking 40 to 60 appearances, 50 to 60 innings. Well, that's like looking at a starting pitcher in May. And they're also coming out for 1 or 2 innings at a shot. So they will come out, and this day they don't have it. They give up 4 runs in 2/3 of an inning. Then they go a month. So when you look at ERA, you look at things like WHIP, things like that. The fact that every outing is a super small sample size to create a larger small sample size makes relief pitchers highly variable. They really are. It's hard to know what to count on one year to the next. So it's really hard to go out there and spend a ton of money on veteran relievers that, you're going to be walking into small sample size. Hector Neris is not a bad relief pitcher. He got thrust into a role he's not super good at. We've talked about it. I won't go into super depth on it. But you saw when the Cubs DFA'd him, he cleared waivers. It took the Astros like 38 seconds to start talking to him and get him signed again. And that's a team that knows what he can do, knows how to use him, knows his limitations. Heading into the postseason, he was a guy they wanted to bring back. So what I think the Cubs should do is take advantage of the young arms they have. That should be the core of the bullpen. I'm really hoping. I've been high on Porter Hodge from the start. I'm really hoping. I love that he's getting the closer opportunity right now. I hope he can continue to do well in that role, because he's a guy who I think has closer stuff. I think he's a guy who can close. And if he can close, that's the other piece. As expensive as good relievers are, that closer tier is really expensive. And if you go at the top end of that pool, they're less volatile than some of the younger guys. Not younger guys, but some of the lower tier guys. But you're still talking, if you're going to go sign somebody like Tanner Scott, you're going to be spending, Edwin Diaz heading into the 2023 season got 1 year, 5 years, $100 million, $20 million a year. You're going to be spending $15 to $20 million on a high-level free agent closer you bring in. And again, depending on where you want to go with payroll, no fans like to hear about budgets, but every organization has a budget. Even Steve Cohen has a budget. He's got a number he won't go over. It seems like it must be like $500 million per season, but there's still a budget there. And so there's still going to be a larger plan that this would have to fit into. And if Porter Hodge can close and be cheap, that's awesome for the organization, because that frees up money to go spend on bats, to go spend on maybe another starting pitcher with Kyle Hendricks likely not back next year. It just gives you more opportunity. Or they're going to need relievers also. Like the bullpen they have right now should not be the bullpen on opening day. They should go add a piece or two. But if you're not spending on a closer, then maybe in that setup man range, maybe you can go try to get one of the top lefties on the market. Go just shop in a higher tier than they did this year with Hector Neris. Have the money and spend it. So I think there's going to be a lot to see with Jed. I've gone on long enough with this. I'm going to go ahead and stick with it. But over the next several weeks, I don't have them specifically mapped out. Like I said, I want to do a series about Jed and kind of how all of this plays into how we should look at the offseason and what's coming next. I want to look at his trades. I've got an episode coming up with Sarah Sanchez where we're going to kind of redo this past offseason. We know what Jed spent to, and we both have our frustrations, and they're different frustrations with the way the Cubs spent. And we're going to we'll never know what would have happened, although I may play around with some MLB The Show simulations. But just present some different options for how that money could have been spent. Different decisions you could have made regarding who to keep. And we'll set some ground rules. I don't have them all mapped out yet, but things like, we can't spend more than Jed did. We can't, I'm going to set trades completely out of it because we have no idea what any team is looking for in trade or who is theoretically available or not. But just looking at guys who are on the market and looking at what they signed for, who could the Cubs, within that same spend, could have put together a different team? How could the Cubs have put together a better team? I think that'll be a lot of fun to go back and forth with her. And we'll do some more. I also want to take a look at free agency, and I took a look at it early in the 2022 into 2023 offseason. But go back and look at what the Cubs have done in free agency and what, not just the Jed era, but going back to Theo's time, like what has Tom supported and what has Tom approved, and what did that look like? What did they get right and what did they get wrong? So expect more on Jed, because this offseason is going to be all about Jed Hoyer and what he does to improve this team. If we're having these same discussions next year about the offense isn't good enough, or the team's not consistent enough, or they have to finish, 15-3 again in their last 18 games to maybe potentially sniff the third wild card spot, Jed's done. I do have full faith that he will be fired if that's the case next year. So, Jed has reason to make this team better. He has all the incentive in the world. It sounds like if there really is friction internally, which I suspect there is from a competitive group of humans, he should be feeling some pressure. And, he wants to win. There's no way he wants to sit there and finish 10 games behind the stinking Brewers every single year. So we'll see. But tonight, I'm excited. The Cubs play the Dodgers again. They got a win last night, 10-4. I don't expect to see Yamamoto for a whole lot tonight. He hasn't pitched in a major league game since June 15th, and his only 2 rehab outings were 2 innings each. He faced 10 hitters in one and 7 hitters in the other. I'd be surprised if he goes more than 3-4 innings, or maybe a 45 to 50, possibly 60 pitch cap on what he's going to do today. So we get to see Yamamoto against Shota, and then we'll get to see a good chunk of that Dodgers bullpen. Hopefully, since they're on the road, the Cubs bats can stay hot and kick the can down the road another day. If and when the Cubs fall out of it next week, I'll probably talk more about moves the Cubs could be making to get some of the kids up. Ed Howard was announced today he's going to go to AAA, and he's going to start tonight. So kind of skipping over AA, I think that probably has way more to do with which guys are where and where the Cubs think they can get him some at-bats. And then Cam Smith is up in AA now. Again, I think that's less a function of, he's zooming through the system, so, credit to him for that. But also it's a function that the A-ball season is over. So you either move him up, and same with Ed Howard, move him up to play AA or AAA, or send him home and start his offseason. So I think some of these guys, I want to keep them going, see what they can see. But hopefully the Cubs pull a W tonight. And as this situation continues to evolve, if and when they go into shutdown mode, when they are either officially out of it or so effectively so that it's time to make other moves, I'll be back on here talking at you again. But thanks for listening. Thank you for joining me today. If you like this episode, please drop a rating and review wherever it is you get your podcasts, and share an episode with a friend. Just a few seconds from you gives me great feedback and helps other Cub fans find the show. You can find me on your podcatcher of choice. Just search for Bleacher Bunch. And you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Threads, Blue Sky, and YouTube, all at CubsPS Plus. And check out the Patreon page, patreon.com/CubsPS Plus, to help support the show. As always, the theme music for this podcast is Prospect Park West by Jerry McCoy. This is Mike Waller, host of the CubsPS Plus podcast. Every day with Cubs baseball or talking about Cubs baseball is a great day. Go Cubs!